A lot of you have probably heard about the SAVE Act. Like I said, it's a bill that was proposed in the House of Representatives. They've attempted to pass it before, and it is unlikely to pass the Senate because it would need to overcome the Senate filibuster, which means that 7 Democrats would have to get on board with it, and it's unlikely that they're going to be able to do that. One of the things that you've probably heard about this is there have been a lot of memes going around, a lot of social media posts going around saying that this could potentially make it so that married women are no longer able to vote, specifically married women that changed their name. And I guess you could say married men as well, because I know some married men who also changed their name. So that means, so that it's different on their driver's license. So basically the idea behind that initial concern was the fact that there's a provision in the bill that basically says that in order to register to vote, you have to bring to that registration specific verified proof that you were born in the United States.
Yeah.
Or at least that you are a citizen of the United States.
Yep.
Now, there are several official government documents that can prove that. Number 1, there's the birth certificate. Number 2, there's the passport.
Yep.
Number 3, some states have what are called enhanced driver's license that will actually say your birthplace on the specific driver's license. So those would be accepted forms of proof that you are a citizen of the United States. The problem is what is currently in the system, your name that's currently in the system or currently on your driver's license, if that is different from the name that is on, say, your birth certificate, which of those types of documentation that I mentioned, the birth certificate is the one that most Americans are most likely to have. Most Americans don't have an enhanced driver's license. Most Americans don't have a passport. I don't have a passport.
Yeah.
But the problem is, if your birth certificate doesn't match what your name is on your driver's license, that could get in the way of your ability to actually be registered to vote.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that this specific aspect of it, I think, is important, but I think it's been a little bit it's been focused on almost to the exclusion of all of the other things that I think are problematic about the SAVE Act, and I think it's for a reasonable reason. It's pretty compelling to say that this might disenfranchise millions and millions of married people, but the fact is, like, it's going to go way beyond that and be way worse than that. So, like, I think a couple of things that you called out. So, one, not only does it require that you have all this proof of your citizenship, it requires that you go in person to your election office to do that. So we can talk about some of the implications there. So that's a huge increase to the barriers of people to register to vote. The second thing is this required documentation and going in person is required every single time there will be a change to your voter registration or if you register to vote for the first time. And according to the Census Bureau, more than 12% of Americans move every single year. So in the 2 years leading up to the 2020 election, 91 million citizens registered to vote for the first time or updated their registration out of 220 million registered voters. So we're talking about, like, this is going to affect tens of millions of people, and it's also going to significantly restrict how people can register to vote. Currently, only 5.9% of people who register to vote do so at an election office, which will have to go to 100% under this act. So that means that, like, millions of people will have to go in, and if we know what people think about voting, they probably won't. And in addition to having these, like, enhanced identification requirements.
One thing that I'd also like to present is one of the potential counterarguments. So the guy that actually proposed this law, who is Representative Chip Roy from Texas, in response to the idea, number one, the idea of this might infringe on your ability to register to vote if you are married or and you changed your name, or if your name doesn't match what's on your birth certificate. What he said in a statement which he sent to factcheck.org, he said, quote, "The legislation provides a myriad of ways for people to prove citizenship and explicitly directs states to establish a process for individuals to register to vote if there are discrepancies in their proof of citizenship due to something like a name change." But here's the problem with that. The bill doesn't specify what documents that they can use that would be satisfactory. Number one, he specifically says the states can establish the process, which is what the bill says. The states can establish that process. But the thing is, there's nothing compelling the states to establish that process. And another thing that we need to recognize is that the bill is going to establish that it is a federal crime for a person who for a voter register, someone who registers other people to vote. It's going to be a federal crime if they register a non-citizen to vote, or they register somebody who doesn't have the proper documentation in order to vote. So basically what this act is saying is that you're going to have registration workers that, to their own discrepancy, are going to have to choose what they think is acceptable and what they think is not. And a lot of them are probably just going to play it safe because they don't want to be charged with a federal crime.
Yeah, totally. Of course. If I were in that position, I would fucking deny everything but the most ironclad proof, which would definitely result in people being turned away from registering. Just imagine what it's like being at the DMV, where they're like, we're going to need 3 different letters from various people, including your pastor, and 12 different forms of documentation for your name, just to do this thing, and then you get sent back to the back of the line each time you need to get a new piece of documentation. You're in the process for hours and all this shit. And that's going to be the process standing between American citizens and their right to vote.
Yeah. And another thing that we need to consider, and I love how Michael called out the fact that a lot of people are focusing specifically on the provision that might affect married people. But another thing that we need to focus on is just the fact that not everybody has access to all of these forms of documentation. First off, like we said, when it comes to passports, almost 150 million Americans do not have a passport.
Yeah.
And on top of that, over 9% of voting age citizens do not have easy access to documents that prove their citizenship. And this is also according to that factcheck.org article that I referenced earlier. So now 9% might not sound like a whole lot, but in our closely divided partisan climate, that is enough to sway an election.
For sure.
And on top of that, that percentage becomes slightly higher when we're talking about Americans who don't identify as white. That number becomes 11%. Now, another thing to consider, and this is something that we also need to be thinking about, because of the fact that this allows for people that register others to vote, because it gives them a significant amount of discrepancy, there's really nothing to stop them from saying, oh, well, this person, maybe because they have a foreign sounding name, or, they're a minority or whatnot, this person I think might not vote the way that I want them to. So I'm just going to be like, you know what? You don't have the documentation that is explicitly laid out in the law. You don't have the documentation to prove that, your name change is that the name change that you have that's different from your birth certificate is, that allows you to still vote. The law does not specifically say that you can use a marriage license in order to prove that you changed your name. The law does not specifically say that you can use that. So I'm just going to play it safe, and I'm not going to register you to vote.
Yep.
There's nothing to prevent that from happening. And
Totally.
in fact, by design, it's kind of encouraged to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's so important to emphasize the lack of coverage of these documents that are needed, because I think it's very tempting to think, well, everybody's got to have one of these, right? Everybody's got to have a passport, or at least a birth certificate, or at least an ID. But to your point, the passport coverage rate is pretty low, and it costs a lot of fucking money to get a passport. It costs an adult between $130 and $237 to get a passport, right? A significant investment. To obtain a certificate of citizenship, it costs $1,385. And to change a name on a birth certificate generally requires a court order and involves court fees that can range from $100 to $400, which essentially, for a lot of these people, acts as a poll tax on being able to vote in the first place. And to your point, Nathan, like, there's no provision in the bill establishing how a person that has changed their name proves that they have changed their name. And then lastly, I think once I heard Real ID should work for this, right? The enhanced driver's license should be like a method that people can use. I think like by the end of May, I think to fly even domestically, you'll have to have a enhanced driver's license. Like, this is something we've been worrying to for a while, so the coverage rates are starting to increase on that. So when I first saw that, I was like, that seems fine. Okay, like maybe this is just a regular old voter ID type bill. The problem is the Real ID or enhanced identification for a lot of states will not actually be able to work for this. So yes, so they say in the bill, right? Quote, a form of identification issued consistent with the requirements of the Real ID Act of 2005 that indicates the applicant is a citizen of the United States can be used. But this is misleading because most states don't have an indication of citizenship on the Real ID, and non-citizens, just permanent legal residents, can obtain a Real ID, which makes, for most states, the Real ID an insufficient form of identification to satisfy this act, which means that it's pretty much just relying on birth certificates and passports. And again, for married people who've changed their name, a birth certificate will not be sufficient.
Yeah. And the other thing that we need to talk about is the fact that this is a solution in search of a problem.
Absolutely.
It's just like we've talked about this multiple times. There have been multiple studies that have shown that voter fraud is virtually non-existent.
Mm-hmm.
That it is there is a statistically insignificant amount of instances, and there has never been any evidence of widespread voter fraud. Certainly not enough to ever sway an election. And specifically, there's never been any actual evidence of widespread voter fraud involving non-citizens trying to vote. Now, so part of what led to the part of the justification of this, let's look at a claim that happened in 2019, a claim from Donald Trump where he said that he sent out a tweet saying that in Texas there were 58 non-citizens who voted, and there were 95,000 non-citizens who registered to vote. All right. Now, the reason why I'm laser focusing on Texas here is because the guy that proposed this law is from Texas. So evidence like this is the type of thing that he's going to cite of, evidence of instances of non-voter. So, where did Donald Trump get those numbers? It's based on the state's efforts to match driver's licenses with state ID applications, specifically from non-citizens to voter rolls. So basically what it says is, okay, we know that this person that has this particular driver's license, we know this person is not a citizen, and yet we can see them on our voter rolls. Now, that might sound straightforward. However, there's one important thing that it does not take into account. It doesn't take into account the fact that people don't always change their driver's license every year or update them with new information. What that means is that a driver's license could theoretically have been issued to somebody who is in the naturalization process, to which that driver's license would still be accounted as, well, this was issued to someone who is not a citizen. But then that person could become a naturalized citizen, then register to vote.
Yep.
And they would be counted in that number. Now, you might hear that and think, well, how often does that actually happen? Well, let's look at history. In 2020, there was this massive attempt to remove non-citizens from voter rolls using the same methodology. They started out with a list of more than 180,000 names, and once they whittled it down to make sure that, to make sure that they were only taking people off that, that were not actually citizens, that didn't go through that process that I explained, where they got the license before they became naturalized citizens. By the time they whittled that initial 180,000 names down, it was less than 100.
Mm-hmm.
It was less than 100.
Yeah.
So no, it's not unreasonable to say that the number of people in that 58,000 number that Donald Trump is citing, it is not unreasonable based on history to say very few of them, very few of those are going to actually be non-citizens who are trying to vote. And the thing is, it's intuitive because, especially in Texas, the penalties for voting as a non-citizen are just not fucking worth it.
Yeah,
seriously.
All
right? You can get serious prison time for that.
Yeah.
For what?
And
just
deportation.
So you add and deportation. Yeah, that's another thing. If you vote as a non-citizen, not only are you deported, you are deported and you're basically barred from ever being able to try to apply for citizenship again in the United States.
Yeah.
It is just not fucking worth it.
It's absurd.
That is why the number is so low. Because why in the hell would you risk that so that you can add one extra vote to a specific individual? Hell, most American citizens, a huge amount of American citizens don't even fucking vote because they don't think their vote matters because it's just one drop in a bucket.
Yeah.
You think that non-citizens think that their votes are going to think that their votes are going to matter so much that they're willing to risk prison time and deportation for it?
Yeah. Yeah, and I want to say a couple things to support that even more, because I think we had in 2024 we had 15 examples from Michigan, to take a state that had some examples of this, that appeared to be non-citizens who did in fact vote in the 2024 election, and none of them appear to be cases where they were nefarious or intentionally voting against the law. All of them that were investigated and adjudicated, because a couple were people that died, that had died after the election. All of them that were investigated, it was literally a mistake, because there are states where and localities and stuff where non-citizens can vote in local elections, right? Where you can vote for your school board and things like that. It's possible to make a mistake. And you might respond to that, or Nathan's case and say well, guys, come on. How likely are those things to happen? And the fact is, the numbers we are talking about are so small that they only exist on these tiny little unlikely edge cases. These 15 cases of non-citizens voting were out of 5.7 million ballots in Michigan. It's just something that doesn't happen nefariously.
Yeah.
The other thing
because
here,
again, it's not worth it.
The other thing here is, one, you might hear people say well, come on, surely we need to have systems in place that ensure that the people who are registering to vote really are citizens. If you hear people say that, they're right, but it just means that they've fallen for the terrible misinformation and disinformation that is going around in this space right now. Because we already do that. All this law does is shift the burden of proof from the election offices and government officials to individuals that are seeking to vote. So today, government officials are required to verify a person's eligibility to vote using state and federal data, including citizenship data from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, as well as data from the Social Security Administration, death data, and U.S. Postal Service change of address data, right? And under federal law, anyone registering to vote must also provide either a driver's license number or the last 4 digits of their Social Security number to provide election officials with sufficient information with those other data sources to determine their identity and that they're actually able and eligible to vote. So all this does is take that verification process, which based on the rates of non-citizens voting and being registered to vote, based on the rates of voter fraud, the system we currently have does work. And all it's doing is taking that burden and shifting it to individuals in a way that's going to disenfranchise millions and millions of people.
And here's another thing you need to understand. The government already fucking knows who the citizens are. Like, the government already has this information.
Yeah.
So here's the thing. Representative Roy, dude that proposed this law, here's the thing. There actually is a way to make sure that only U.S. citizens are registering to vote. Automatic voter registration. Because the government already has that information. The government already has information on who the citizens are. Now, they can use that information. They already use that information to figure out, like, what you owe them in taxes, you know, which means that if you don't fill out your taxes correctly, they come back to you and bite you in the ass, which, I mean, you know, is also a reason why we should have, like, you know, we shouldn't have to file our taxes because they already have that information. But that's a whole nother conversation. But the point is, they already have that information.
Yeah.
So just if you are honestly worried about non-citizens trying to register to vote, just do automatic voter registration.
Yeah.
Boom,
yeah.
Problem solved.
And I want to go ahead and give ourselves a pat on the back here as like the last point I want to make as part of this segment. Nathan and I are progressive, and we talk about convincing Democrats to do stuff a lot because we largely align with Democrats on policy. But but people have accused us of being partisan, and I don't think that's true. And I think this segment is a good example of that. Because if we were truly partisan, we would be in support of this bill. Because the people that will be disenfranchised by this bill most will be Republicans and Trump voters.
Yeah.
So only 1 in 4 Americans with a high school degree or less have a valid passport. Only 1 in 5 Americans who are low income, below $50,000, or who have income below $50,000 a year, have a valid passport. Republicans are less likely to possess a passport, and conservative Republican-leaning women are twice as likely to have changed their names. Young Americans with a college degree or a postgraduate degree, wealthy Americans, and those who identify as liberal or Democrats are the most likely groups to possess the required forms of documentation in order to continue to vote.